Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome to the UCCS Speaker Series. Pleasure to welcome you again this week as always. This is the second session of our fall quarter series, and this week we have an opportunity to investigate the second of our themes for this year, the three themes being economic recovery before, during, after the COVID-19 pandemic, supporting California's changing workforce, and today's theme, the future of publicly funded education. Today, we ask specifically, how can Sacramento guard against ever-widening disparities in learning? How can we aid teachers to innovate with blended learning as it's become necessary to implement in the face of the pandemic, and how do we entertain new funding options while waiting for tax revenues to rebound in what we hope is the upcoming economic recovery? So to help us address those questions and others, we're very pleased to have with us two very distinguished speakers. First, Elaine Eastin. She's a former California Assemblywoman who served 8 years in the Assembly between 1986 and 1994. She was the first woman elected as State Superintendent of Public Instruction and served alongside both Pete Wilson and Gray Davis from 1995 to 2003. She also, as I recall, got her start in local government, I think on the Planning Commission in Union City, and worked her way through a distinguished policy career. Throughout that career, she's been a fierce and effective advocate for education from pre-K all the way through college. She herself is a graduate of both UC Davis, where she got her bachelor's degree, and UC Santa Barbara, where she earned a master's. And she's been part of the professoriate, most recently at Mills College. She's finally, Ms. Eastin is a strong supporter of both the University of California and the UC Center Sacramento, specifically serving in the past as a UC Center Sacramento Governance Fellow and is a current member of the UCCS Advisory Board. Following her remarks, we'll be hearing from Bruce Fuller. Professor Fuller is a professor of education and public policy at UC Berkeley. His work focuses on how public policies penetrate into schools and families, thus changing the behavior of local actors. And in his work on decentralizing policy, he is focused on how school reforms often fail to accomplish these changes, leading to questions about how to create better policies. Professor Fuller has a PhD in the sociology of education from Stanford, and he's previously worked at both Harvard and the World Bank. He's been a prior guest at UCCS, and I know that you'll enjoy hearing from him as well as former Assemblywoman Eastin. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce first Elaine Eastin.
Thank you so much, Rich, and my thanks to all of your team for what they've done to help us get this organized today. Very thorough. You know, the history of California and its support for publicly funded education is extraordinary. Really, when you measure what we were doing more than 50 years ago as compared to the rest of our country and the world, it was quite exceptional. And I say this because we have come to a point where we have been losing ground. And let me just step back for a minute and remind everybody that when we created the Silicon Valley, there was no confluence of rivers. We don't have a Tigris and Euphrates. Our Fertile Crescent was a combination of wonderful achievements in K-12 and in higher education. Silicon Valley was born where it was because of many great colleges and universities, as well as a very fine K-12 system. We were invested in the kids, and for something extraordinary to consider is to think about a group of people coming out of a Great Depression and a terrible war, the worst the world had ever seen, and deciding to come home with optimism and hope and put their roll their sleeves up and put their shoulder to the wheel and create a fabulous educational system. The fact is, there was a new commitment to equity at that time and to fairness in supporting student achievement, initially filling the gaps created by lack of income and or geography, and eventually filling gaps for race and gender for increasing numbers of our students. We're still on that path. But in fact, we also filled gaps by improving teacher requirements. We were the first state to require that extra year of education to be a teacher, and providing extra resources and scaffolding for certain classes of students and improving the data-driven approach to educational practice. The goal was to enlist educators and children, parents and families and communities to enhance a systemic educational change. And while it is clear that systemic racism and still disadvantages way too many of our students, we have developed an increasingly strong commitment to conscientiously creating systems that are intentional in developing an intersectional approach to all factors affecting all students, regardless of gender or race or income. The truth is, things like the Americans with Disabilities Act point to a commitment on the part of this society to educate all our children. We have to be even more conscious about intentionality and equity, because we are living in a time that calls for that. You know, I have said for decades that budgets are statements of values. If you remember nothing else I say today, remember, budgets are statements of values. And our commitment here in California, whether in preschool and child development or in K-12 education or higher education, is under more stress in the last 3 decades than it was on the 3 decades before that. If you look at preschool and child development, what you'll find is that Georgia and Oklahoma and Florida are probably ahead of us. Now, Florida, the voters rose up in their righteous wrath and told then Governor Jeb Bush to put a sock in it, and they voted to tax themselves. Here in California, we voted to put a higher tax on tobacco, thanks to Rob Reiner and his dad, Carl, who stepped in when the tobacco industry rolled the store in. But please remember, when I graduated from high school in the state of California, California was 5th of the 50 states in per pupil spending, tied with New York. The year was 1965. When I became superintendent of public instruction, we were 47th in per pupil spending. How's that for a fall from grace? The reality is that California had, and by the way, when I left office, we had crawled back to 27th, scratching and kicking and screaming the whole way. I managed to get some money from both governors, and part of it came from lawsuits. But the bottom line is that we reduced class size in kindergarten through 3rd grade to 20 or less, and under Pete Wilson, in spite of his objection for months. But when we were winning the lawsuit and we were going to get the money for schools, he agreed to go along with class size reduction. But instead of the 4-year plan that I'd proposed, he wanted us to do it in 6 weeks, which is why it was a little chaotic in the beginning. But it was well worth doing. I met a teacher the other day. She stopped me on the street. She said, "Are you Delane Eastin?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, you don't know me. We've never met. But I want you to know you added 8 years to my teaching career." I said, "Really? How did I do that?" She said, "Well, I had this class, 2nd grade class with 34 children. And I went home and told my husband after the first week, I didn't know all their names. For the first time in all the years I'd been teaching, I did not know all the children's names, let alone all their needs. I said, I can't do this. So I'll teach 1 more year and then I'll take early retirement." Well, the next year we did class size reduction, 20 to 1 or less. Her class went from 34 to 20. She didn't just teach that next year, she taught 8 years beyond that. No, I didn't do it for the teachers. I did it for the children. But the reality is that the truth is going to be told here. This country runs on other people's children. We have a responsibility to every child to give them the great education. I once debated Milton Friedman down in Silicon Valley when there was a voucher on the ballot. A dad got up and he said, I can't worry about other people's children. I'm just worried about my children. I want a voucher so my children can go to private school. And I said, oh, you don't fly? He says, I fly all the time. I said, do you ever fly with your family? He said, why, yes. We're going on vacation next week. I said, well, good. When you get on that airplane, remember somebody else's child is the pilot. Somebody else's child is the air traffic controller. Somebody seeing you and your family safely home. Someone else's child is the machinist who machined the parts in that wing assembly when it lifts up so beautifully and you and your family land safely. This country runs on other people's children. And we in California must make a recommitment to education for all. When I left office, we were 27th in per pupil spending, but we're right now 38th. And yet, did you know we're number one in something? Per prisoner expenditure. It's just shocking to me that we would be 37th when we were 5th, and that now we would be 38th, I think it is, 38th, and now we would be looking at further cuts in the coming years because of the budget. Look, I was brought up in this state, and I'm shocked to tell you that by 1985, 9 out of the 10 UC campuses were built and opened. All but 3 of the 23 state university campuses were built and opened by 1985. And all but 16 of the 116 campuses of the California Community College system were built and opened. By the way, did you know we're the first state to have a community college system? We didn't copy some other state. They copied us. The truth is, we have not been investing in K-12, where we've dropped to 38th in per pupil spending, but we've also seen a staggering drop in what we're investing in higher education. We used to spend 18% of the state of California budget on higher ed. That's dropped to around 10%. The fact is that we were not in a global economy in the same sense that we are today. Oh, we were competing with other first world countries. Europe had just been through a terrible war, and yet we still had the sense to invest in education. Now we not only have the European countries back on their heels, but we've got China and India and so many other nations that are competing with us, and we're disinvesting in education. You know, in 1960, we did a master plan for higher education. As I said, we were investing 18% of the state budget in higher ed. But meanwhile, we were, very proud of what we were doing for all the kids in all the systems. We had a master plan. We also had a California Post-Secondary Coordinating Council to foster cooperation between and among the various segments of our higher ed system. That was done away with in 2011, I would say, false economy. And last year, Governor Newsom vetoed a bill to reinstate it. We've got to foster better communication between and among higher ed, and then we've got to reinvest in K-12. I want to come back to this issue of equity. We blithely told a bunch of kids to go home and do distance learning when the pandemic hit. Except, did you know that 30% of the kids in LA don't have access to a computer at home? Are you aware how much of the state doesn't have the internet? Vast rural regions, but also many of our foster youth, many kids who are in English learner households who are living very close to the poverty line. Many kids living below the poverty line don't have access to technology. We hear people in Sacramento talking about buying more Chromebooks. If you don't have the internet, Chromebook is like a big fancy lamp with a beautiful bulb, but you don't have electricity. What good is it? The fact is, we need to invest not only in great educational blueprints, but we need great teachers, and then we need great ways to deliver that information. And believe me, during a pandemic, if you're going to talk about distance learning, you have to look each other right in the eye and say, We need a plan to give every kid access to hotspots and internets. You know how many stories? There's just on one on NPR this morning. Kids sitting out in the cold, shivering under the eaves of their school so they could have access to internet. Bottom line is that's happening all over California. And it's a real problem in rural California as well as in the most poor families of our state. The bottom line is, in my family, the kids came first. No matter what was going on, they kept the cuts as far away from the children as they possibly could. But right now, we're telling everybody everybody has to share the pain. Everybody has to suffer some cuts. You know, that's not what the state constitution says. I want you to get it out and look at it. Article 16, Section 8. It says, quote, "From all state revenues, there shall first be set apart the monies to be applied by the state for support of the public school system and public institutions of higher education," end quote. Says that in the Constitution. Do you know how many people have come up to me and said, does it really say that in the state constitution? And some of them are legislators who take an oath to uphold it, but don't know what it says. The bottom line is, it is really time for us to have a conversation about the future of publicly funded education. But that's going to mean the citizenry has got to elect even stronger people, and we've got some rock stars who do stand up for us, but we've got some wishy-washy ones who essentially are going, well, we all have to share the pain. No, that is not how responsible families function. When my dad went on strike and my parents had not enough money because of some horrible auto repair or some other problem, they didn't tell my brother and I we'd have to hunker down and make with less. We didn't know how bad things were most of the time. And the reality is that's what the state should do. We should first set apart the monies for the education of children, as our Constitution says we should. And I can tell you that if we do that, what we will see is an amazing opportunity as we move into the future. In the private sector, I learned the difference between expense and investment. Yes, I spent several years there. And when I got to Sacramento, I was shocked at how many people, especially at the Department of Finance, treated everything like it was an expense. They didn't know the difference between expense and investment. Education is an investment in the future of California. And we need to elect people who understand that. And then we need to hold their feet to the fire. We should first take care of preschool and child development. Kindergarten needs to be mandatory and full day. And oh, by the way, a few people won't like that, but the reality is that right now we have a record number of women leaving the workforce because they don't have child development and they having to go home to take care of either a preschool or a child in kindergarten, first or second grade because they can't be home alone. Did you know that in America we have over 1 million latchkey kids under the age of 5? It's estimated that up to 20% of them are in California. I've talked to social workers who found kids whose cribs had been turned into caves so the parents could go to work. They essentially turned them into prisons and covered them up and told the kids that they'd be home in 8 or 10 hours. Bottom line is, it's really time for California to understand steepest curve of learning is 0 to 5. We need comprehensive child development for all children. And then we need to, yes, have full day kindergarten that's mandatory. Yes, invest again in K-12 education. We need to get back in the top 10 at a minimum. I would argue 5th sounds pretty good to me. We need to invest and we need to understand that Neil Postman had it right. He said, children are living messages we send to a time we will never see. What is our message to the future? My dad came out of the hills of Kentucky. He was one of 13 children. 9 grew to adulthood. A few of them got higher education, partly because my dad joined the Navy and sent money home after the house burned down and his father went bankrupt in the Great Depression. But of the cousins, 18 cousins, one's a Down syndrome, one didn't get a degree, went to college for a while. 2 had AA degrees. They're in their 90s or would be. They taught school with an AA in Kentucky. The other 14 of us who live all over the country, the other 14 of us all have at least a bachelor's degree. And we've had wonderful lives because we got wonderful educations. I believe in data-driven decision-making, and our data does tell us that education is the secret to great success. But we also have to remember what that Mets second baseman understood when the Mets surprisingly didn't wind up in the cellar but went to the World Series. He said, you gotta believe. If we believe in these children and we give them a chance, they will become architects and engineers. They'll become the air traffic controllers and the machinists. They'll be the teachers and the lawyers. They'll be the doctors and the lab technicians. They're both important when you get a test ordered. We'll have people that'll be part of the new economy, that'll be nimble and able to respond to the future if we invest in education. We'll also have people with values about the future of this state and our country, values about equal opportunity and values about wonderful experiences with literature and music and art and football and track and so many things. Life is amazing when you have a chance to really enjoy and experience it. And the way to do that is to get a great education. So I want to believe in a brilliant future for California and America, and therefore I want to believe in generously funded public education. We need that, and we need to make sure that the people in our legislature and the Congress understand the most important thing we do in a democratic society is to educate our children. Thank you all very much for your interest, and I look forward to Professor Fuller's remarks.
Thanks, Delane.
Yeah, thanks very much, Professor Fuller. Just go right ahead.
I'm going to be a little less inspiring and a little more wonky, but I do want to take up Delane's major takeaway point that state budgets are statements of values. They're a moral compass, a moral blueprint for how we invest in education. And I wanted to share some thoughts about how we might start to rebuild the education budget in Sacramento to really advance the commitments that Delane just outlined. And I'll try to be brief so we can have enough time for questions. Let me cover 3 areas. First, what can be learned from the post-2009 era. That is, we went through a recession a decade ago, and maybe it's helpful to pause and think about what we can learn from that period. Secondly, as we rebuild the budget post-COVID, hopefully as revenues come back, as Delane mentioned, how do we set out key principles and priorities? We're not going to be able to refund everything at prior levels, at least not in the next 2 or 3 years. So how do we establish some basic tenets and principles for rebuilding the budget? And thirdly, a little bit of skepticism maybe, which is, will we lose some opportunities as we come out of the COVID recession? We have school institutions. I work in a university. These institutions are sometimes sticky. They're sometimes divided by fragmented interests. And I wanted to say a little bit about how to avoid those pitfalls as we try to reinvest in education. Briefly, and I'm happy to go deeper during the Q&A if these things are of interest. But very briefly, some of you may recall that in the wake of the 2009 financial crash, K-12 spending fell by 1/5, 20% cut in real dollars between 2009 and 2012. In contrast, so far we're a little better off than we were after the financial crash. As many of you know, the legislature and Governor Newsom worked hard over the summer to try to maintain the current K-12 program, to maintain earlier investments in child development and pre-K, as Delane outlined. Higher ed took somewhat of a hit. We're not too happy about that here at Berkeley. But certainly the K-12 program was protected. I want to come back to how that was financed. But we are in better shape. Revenues are coming in a little stronger than worst case scenarios. This is sort of a cruel recession in the sense that it's really poor and working class families that are bearing the overwhelming brunt of this economic turndown. Those of us that can work at home or have fairly stable incomes, we continue to work on Zoom day in and day out. We're still paying taxes, and the revenue picture is not as bad as it could be. The other thing to keep in mind is that coming out of the recession, Jerry Brown radically increased spending on K-12. This was, of course, driven in part by the Prop 98 funding guarantee, as well as rising revenues. Spending today now in K-12 is $23 billion higher per year than it was prior to the recession. So the system has benefited from recovery, and we want to know how we can replicate that. Governor Brown also, as you know, blew up a few of his own boxes, an effort made famous by Governor Schwarzenegger in reducing the complexity of the budget and returning more fiscal responsibility and ideally accountability back to local school boards. The other, I think one wild card in all this is that in the last 10 years until COVID, the state benefited enormously from rising property tax revenues given a booming housing market. If the housing market continues to be strong, that's good news for Prop 98 as well as K-12 funding, but that's a big if as this recession persists and perhaps grows worse. And of course, long-term structural problems, pension costs continue to increase. The governor had to pull back a little bit on the state contribution to the pension funding over the summer, and health insurance costs will continue to rise. So we have some opportunities and some real risks going forward. Within that context, then, how do we stay honest, or how do we sharpen budget priorities for children and families in the next 2 to 3 years? What values, what moral principles do we put forward in these budget blueprints as we proceed? I'd put forward maybe 3 basic tenets that could help rebuild how we think about K-12 budgeting, and as well as child development and pre-K funding. One is to keep addressing worsening inequities. As Delane just mentioned, we have pretty good evidence in recent months that achievement gaps are actually growing as more advantaged kids can log on and participate in online instruction. Maybe one of their parents can afford to stay home and help tutor and coach kids. Meanwhile, working class and poor kids are either not logging on, don't have access to broadband internet, the kinds of disparities that you've been reading about in recent months. So can the state actively try to recover that loss, or are we just going to return to the status quo and hope that somehow we can narrow achievement gaps? The other big lesson from local control funding, even though we're now spending $23 billion more per year than we were earlier, is that we've made no progress in narrowing achievement gaps even before COVID-19. This is a real sad story that in the early years of local control funding, we had a modest bump in student achievement. That has since leveled out, and we've seen almost no proportional gains by Latino or African American kids. We've been doing work here at Berkeley. PPIC is also doing work. In part, this lack of progress is due to the fact that oftentimes the poor children in districts are not actually receiving the money, even though they're generating the initial additional revenues in districts. We also have a study coming out next month which shows that as school districts hired more teachers in these good years with local control funding, they hired a lot of inexperienced teachers, and then those teachers were assigned to English learners. So we have these district disparities and within school disparities that this hopeful policy has really not addressed. And I think this is a huge lesson as we start to recover funding for local control support. I think we could do more in terms of simplifying access to child development and pre-K programs. The state now spends over $7 billion if you add up childcare, pre-K, and paid family leave. These programs have been built sort of in helter-skelter fashion. The state under Jerry Brown did consolidate some of the pre-K categorical programs, but this is still a confusing maze of support programs that continue to receive additional funding. Governor Newsom has been very committed to this sector, as you know, but from the ground, from the grassroots, some of these boxes and programs look entirely confusing and difficult to access. And finally, I think a basic budget priority could be to incentivize innovation. As Delane mentioned, we have school districts doing all sorts of things online. The charter school sector got into this hybrid approach to online and in-class instruction years ago, but we're not systematically learning about what's working, nor are we really thinking carefully in Sacramento about how do we capture these innovations. Should we go back to traditional in-class instruction? Should we move towards a more combined program? With Silicon Valley at our doorstep, we're still not thinking very carefully about combining digital sources of knowledge and learning with traditional classrooms. So again, the question is, as we rebuild and invest in K-12, do we think about and sharpen these priorities, or we just go back to a status quo that was getting us by, but really not doing much to reduce terrible disparities in which children get ahead in California? And finally, just let me briefly, a few words of warning in terms of why it's not likely that budgeteers in Sacramento and policymakers are going to sharpen these priorities and think very creatively. First of all, during these downturns, special interests, of course, begin to feel starved, and they push just to recover what they had before. It's very hard when budgets are going down to rethink, to simplify, to recast the array of public programs that are out there. And I think this is going to require some leadership to get special interest groups around the table, all of whom have legitimate interests and priorities, but to think more creatively about how we structure the budget, how we structure programs, how we innovate in K-12, how we perhaps simplify access to child development and early education. Fiscal resources will remain very tight. We basically have a $10 billion hole in the K-12 budget in the form of deferred payments. One way the legislature softened the blow was to not make a budget cut for K-12, but to simply postpone reimbursements to districts. Well, that's going to come due fairly soon, and somehow we've got to fill this hole. There is talk of some additional stimulus money. If our current president can get his story straight and his position straight, there may yet be additional economic stimulus, which would bring money to K-12 and perhaps about $50 billion nationally for childcare and pre-K, which would be a huge boost for parents struggling to get back to work. Prop 15 is on the November ballot. Even if it does pass, it's not a lot of money. It's going to be helpful and probably worthy of support by those of us that back public education. It's not going to be a panacea, and it's probably 2 or 3 years out before those dollars start to augment Prop 98 dollars. And of course, there's the question whether the governor gets distracted from his earlier priorities. He's been very strong on early education. He's tried to continue to incrementally expand local control funding. He's increased the earned income tax credit for poor families. But with such enormous pressure from fires to healthcare costs, it's easy for governors to get distracted. And so sticking honestly to a given set of priorities will be a challenge both for the governor and legislative leaders. Finally, can we somehow fix and improve local control funding so that it actually does narrow achievement gaps? The program is way behind its promising rhetoric in terms of advancing equity in public education. And finally, the state hasn't been very good in actually learning about what's working with regard to online instruction. Everyone's rightfully been scrambling, just trying to deliver the K-12 program to engage as many kids as possible. But we have a real opportunity to learn about effective practices, and then trying to rethink how we organize elementary and secondary schools. This model's been around for about 150 years in America, and much in the world has changed, including digital learning, digital environments. So we have much to do in terms of bringing those innovations back into the existing institution and thinking in more creative ways. So keeping clear on priorities, being realistic about how we can move interest groups, tackling the guts and the stickiness of the school institution as we go forward. These are going to be the challenges, Rich and Delane, that I think we face in the next 2 or 3 years.
All right. Well, great. Well, thanks to both of you for that terrific introduction. Superintendent Eastin, are you still there? You are. All right, you returned. So I think there already are a few questions that have popped up on the board. We're asking everyone to please use the Zoom feature under participants to raise your hand, and then a member of the UCCS staff will call on you, and then you can address your question directly to Ms. Eastin or Professor Fuller, or to both. So let's go ahead and take questions.